Chapter 1. The silence between days. The coffee maker sputtered and hissed like it resented the morning. Jason Reynolds stood in the kitchen, his hand resting on the counter as the smell of fresh brew filled the still air. The sun had just begun to edge over the rooftops, turning the condensation on the window into streaks of light. He poured the coffee into a chipped white mug, "World's greatest dad." The words had faded to a ghost of themselves, the handle cracked and glued twice over. He couldn't bring himself to throw it away. It had been 6 years since his son Sammy died. 6 years of mornings like this, quiet, mechanical, suffocatingly routine. The doctors had said leukemia in that soft, rehearsed tone, as if gentleness could dull the blade. Jason still remembered every detail. The sterile smell of antiseptic, the steady beep of the heart monitor, the way Sarah's hand shook as she tried to hold his. They'd fought for so long that when the fight ended, there was no energy left to stand. He'd buried his son and, months later, watched his marriage dissolve, not in anger, but in sorrow. Sarah had been 33, radiant even in grief. They had loved each other too much to stay in the ruins of what they'd lost. Every glance between them became a mirror of the past. So one day, she packed her things, kissed his cheek, and said, "We need to let each other heal, Jason. I want you to live again." He had nodded. Because what else was there to say? The garage was where Jason spent most of his evenings now. The '57 Chevy Bel Air sat beneath a tarp, a slow-burning promise he'd made to himself and to Sammy. The restoration wasn't just a project, it was atonement. The car would be auctioned for leukemia research, a gesture to say, "I couldn't save him, but maybe this will save someone else." Every nut, every bolt, every drop of polish was a prayer. Sometimes his coworkers stopped by to help. They didn't say much. They knew silence was Jason's preferred language. But they respected him. Always had. He was the guy who showed up when your truck wouldn't start. The one who spent his Saturday helping you move without asking for a beer in return. Now they gave him what he needed most, space. The day the moving truck came, Jason almost didn't notice. He was sanding down a door panel when he heard laughter, real, bright, and out of place in his quiet world. He looked up to see a woman standing on the curb, directing movers with a mix of exhaustion and authority. Brown hair pulled back, worn jeans, a navy t-shirt that read coffee first, then life. A boy darted between boxes, maybe 12 or 13, trying to balance one on his shoulder before dropping it with a yelp. Jason set down the sander and wiped his hands on a rag. Something about the scene, the ordinary chaos of it, felt foreign and familiar at the same time. New neighbors. His co-worker Tom called from across the street, already heading over. "Come on, Reynolds. Let's make a good impression." Jason hesitated but followed. By the time he reached the truck, Tom and another neighbor were already unloading furniture. The woman turned, surprised. "Oh, you don't have to, ma'am. Around here that's not optional," Tom said with a grin. Jason offered a quiet nod. "Where you want this box?" She blinked, then smiled. "Inside, if you don't mind. I'm Alice. That's my son, Scott." Scott looked up, a little wary but curious. "Hi." Jason nodded again. "Hey, Scooter." The boy frowned. "Scooter." Jason's mouth tugged upward slightly. "You move fast enough, you'll earn it." Alice laughed, a sound light enough to crack something open inside him. By the time the truck was empty, the sun had dropped low, painting the street gold. The neighborhood women were gathered around Alice, offering baked goods and welcome smiles. Jason stayed on the edge of the crowd, polite but distant. When Alice finally turned to thank him, he just nodded. "Welcome to the neighborhood." She watched him walk back to his garage, curious about the man who said so little, but somehow made his silence feel like a story. That night, as he sat in his living room, Jason stared out the window toward the new house. He could see the faint glow of a lamp through the curtains, shadows moving as mother and son unpacked their lives. For a moment, he wondered what it might be like to start over. Then he looked down at the mug in his hand, the fading words, the crack along the handle, and the thought dissolved like breath on glass. The night deepened, quiet settling over the street once more. And in the silence, the world kept turning. Chapter 2. The move in. The first morning in a new house always felt like waking up in someone else's life. Alice Phelps stood in the kitchen, barefoot on cold tile, her hands wrapped around a mug that read "Best Mom Ever," a garage sale find. Chipped at the rim, but loved anyway. Through the window, sunlight painted her backyard in soft gold. The moving boxes still loomed everywhere like tired soldiers, labeled in black marker. Kitchen, books, Scott's room. She exhaled a long, quiet breath and said to no one, "One box at a time, Alice. You've done harder things." Scott, her 13-year-old tornado of energy, was already clattering around upstairs, probably trying to find the box with his gaming console. She smiled to herself. Kids always had a way of finding the essentials first. It was strange being here. Quiet. Safe, even. That was new. For years, she'd been running from places that didn't feel like home, apartments that smelled like mold, jobs that barely paid enough to cover both rent and groceries, and a marriage that had collapsed under the weight of disappointment and blame. This house was supposed to be different. A chance to reset. A small, rented slice of peace. She walked outside to the back patio, mug in hand, and took in her new surroundings. The yard was simple, bordered by an old wooden fence. Beyond it, she could hear faint sounds of someone working, a steady rhythm of tools, the hum of a sander. The neighbor on that side was the quiet man from yesterday, Jason Reynolds. There was something about him that lingered in her mind. The way he'd carried the heavy furniture without a word, how he'd called Scott Scooter, gentle teasing that had made her son grin. His face was kind, but there was a weight behind his eyes, the kind that came from long, hard years. Alice didn't know his story, but she recognized the look. She'd seen it in the mirror too many times. Mom, Scott's voice broke through her thoughts. Can I go outside? Sure, she said. But stay where I can see you, okay? He was gone before she finished the sentence, bounding out the back door, kicking at the grass like a puppy off its leash. Alice smiled faintly, sipping her coffee. Then she heard it, Scott's voice, loud and curious. Whoa, cool car. Her stomach dropped. Scott. Too late. He was already peeking over the fence. Jason looked up from his workbench, safety glasses perched on his head. His sleeves were rolled up, forearms streaked with grease and sunlight. He followed the voice to the boy leaning over the fence. Hey there, Scooter, he said, smiling faintly. You like old cars? Scott grinned. They're awesome. My dad used to talk about fixing one up, but we never did. Jason studied the boy for a moment, then nodded. This one's a '57 Chevy. You can come see it if you want, just don't touch anything sharp. Alice hurried across the lawn, cheeks flushed. Scott, don't bother. It's fine, Jason said quietly. He's not bothering me. Alice froze mid-step. There was something disarming in his calmness. She crossed her arms, trying to look composed. He's curious. I swear, he'll climb inside an engine if I don't watch him. Jason chuckled softly. Curiosity's not a bad thing. That's how I got started. Scott was already beside the car, wide-eyed. Can you teach me how it works? Jason met Alice's eyes, hesitant at first. Sure, if it's okay with your mom. She hesitated. Her instinct was to say no. She'd met too many people who smiled first and disappointed later. But there was something steady about Jason Reynolds, something that told her he wasn't a man who said things he didn't mean. Finally, she nodded. If you don't mind. But if he becomes a nuisance, he won't, Jason said. And I don't mind. For the next hour, Scott was lost in a world of chrome and gears, asking questions faster than Jason could answer. Alice stood by the fence, watching them. Jason showed him how to sand a section of the fender, guiding his hand gently, patient as if he'd done this 100 times before. There was a kind of peace in him, even in silence. When the boy accidentally dropped a wrench and flinched, Jason just smiled. Hey, no harm done. The car's tough. So am I. Alice felt her throat tighten unexpectedly. He's good with him, she thought. Later that evening, after dinner, Scott could talk about nothing else. Mom, Jason said the car's for charity. Like, he's rebuilding it to raise money for kids with cancer. Isn't that cool? Alice looked up from the dishes, softening. That's really wonderful, actually. Can I go help him again tomorrow? We'll see, she said, hiding her smile. As she wiped down the counter, her eyes drifted to the darkened garage next door. The faint glow of a work light was still visible through the open door. She wondered what loss drove a man to spend his nights rebuilding something for someone else. And she wondered, just briefly, if maybe, in some quiet way, this neighborhood had brought them both here for the same reason. To start over. Chapter 3. Small kindnesses. Jason hadn't realized how long it had been since the sound of laughter had filled his garage. Now it came every afternoon. The light, uneven rhythm of Scott's voice asking a dozen questions at once, the thud of tools being moved, the metallic ring of dropped bolts. It was chaos, but the good kind. He tried to tell himself he was just teaching the kids some basics, just passing on a skill, but the truth was, he liked the company. Scott reminded him of Sammy in flashes, the curiosity, the way his mind never sat still. There were moments, small and cruel, when Jason almost turned to call Sammy's name before remembering. And then he'd take a breath, steady himself, and focus on the work. The Chevy didn't ask for words, only time. Across the fence, Alice had noticed the change. She could hear them sometimes through the open window while she folded laundry or prepped dinner. Jason's low, calm explanations, Scott's bright chatter in response. See, this part here's the carburetor. It mixes the air and fuel. So it's like the lungs of the car? Jason chuckled. Exactly. Smart kid. It was strange how sound carried comfort with it. Before moving here, she'd spent years in apartments where noise meant tension, arguments, slammed doors, late-night regret. Now, the noise outside was gentle, human, something that made the walls feel less empty. One Saturday, Alice came home from the grocery store to find Jason in her yard. He was crouched by the gate, tools scattered neatly beside him. Her first instinct was alarm, until she saw what he was doing. Your latch was loose, he said, without looking up. If you don't fix it, the wind'll take the gate off its hinges. She blinked, setting down her grocery bags. You could have just told me. He finally looked up, wiping his hands on a rag. You were gone. Easier to just fix it. Alice studied him for a moment. The sun caught in the gray at his temples, in the fine lines that deepened when he squinted. There was a quiet steadiness to him, the kind that didn't need to fill space with words. Well, she said softly. Thank you. Jason nodded, gathering his tools. No problem. He started to head toward the fence when she called after him. You drink coffee? He paused. Every day. Good. Because you just earned one. They sat on the back porch a few minutes later, two mismatched mugs between them, steam curling into the morning air. Alice tried not to stare at the way Jason held his cup, both hands around it as if it anchored him. He seemed unsure what to do with small talk, so she filled the silence. Scott really looks up to you, you know. I think you've made a new fan. Jason shrugged lightly. He's a good kid. He is, she said with quiet pride. Sometimes I worry about him, though. It's been just the two of us for a while. Moving here, it was supposed to be a new start. Jason nodded, thoughtful. New starts are good. He hesitated. Hard, but good. Alice caught the flicker in his expression, a shadow that passed quickly but not unnoticed. She wanted to ask, what happened to you? But she knew that kind of question had to wait until someone was ready to answer it. Later that afternoon, she heard a knock on the door. When she opened it, Jason stood there holding her mailbox flag in his hand. This broke off, he said simply. Fixed it. Alice couldn't help but laugh. You're like a one-man maintenance crew. He gave a half smile. Old habits. Helps me stay busy. Busy's not so bad, she said, tilting her head. As long as it's not hiding. That made him pause. His eyes lifted to hers, and for a heartbeat, she thought she'd gone too far. Then he nodded once, slow. You're right. As the weeks passed, small kindnesses became a language of their own. Jason fixed her leaky faucet. Alice brought over extra lasagna after dinner. He mowed the strip of grass between their yards without saying a word. She left a thank you note on his porch with 2 lemon muffins. It wasn't flirtation, not yet. It was recognition. 2 people learning the rhythm of each other's silences. One night, after Scott had gone to bed, Alice stood by the window, watching the faint light from Jason's garage. He was still in there, head bent over the Chevy, the soft hum of a radio drifting through the night air. Something about the sight, the quiet dedication, the patience, moved her. This was a man carrying something heavy, but he carried it with grace. She whispered to the empty room, you deserve peace, whoever you are. And though he couldn't hear her, somewhere deep inside, Jason Reynolds began to believe it too. Chapter 4. Across the fence line, the late summer heat lingered long into evening, the air thick with the smell of cut grass and engine oil. Jason stood by the open garage door, wiping his hands with a rag. The Chevys had gleamed beneath the hanging bulb, months of work distilled into soft reflection. He heard the back door next door open, the faint clink of a wine glass against the railing. Alice was there again, sitting on her porch, her feet tucked beneath her. They'd fallen into a quiet routine. Most nights, after Scott had gone inside, Jason would tinker with the car while Alice read or tended to her small garden. Sometimes they spoke, sometimes they didn't. It didn't matter. The comfort was in the knowing. Tonight, though, the stillness felt different. Hey, she called softly across the fence. Jason looked up. Hey, still at it. He nodded. Always something to fix. Alice took a slow sip of her wine. You ever finish fixing things? Jason leaned against the garage door frame, thoughtful. Maybe not. Maybe we're not supposed to. She smiled faintly. That sounds exhausting. He gave a half shrug. Better than the alternative. The alternative being? He hesitated, glancing toward the car. Doing nothing. Letting the silence win. Alice tilted her head, studying him. You don't strike me as a man who loses to silence. Jason let out a quiet breath. You'd be surprised. They met at the fence line a few minutes later, drawn by something unspoken. The porch light from Alice's house and the garage bulb from Jason's combined to cast soft shadows on their faces. Scott's been talking about that car nonstop, she said, leaning her arms against the top of the fence. He's got me Googling vintage Chevys in my free time. I think you've started something. Jason smiled, just barely. He's got a good eye? Picks things up fast. He's had to, Alice said softly. We've moved around a lot. Jason nodded. That's hard on a kid. Hard on both of us, really. But we manage. There was a brief silence. The kind that teetered between comfortable and confessional. Jason broke it first. You ever get tired of managing? Alice looked at him, really looked. Every day. She smiled faintly. But quitting's not really an option, is it? Jason shook his head. No, it's not. The conversation drifted then into smaller things. Neighborhood quirks, the best coffee in town, the endless chore of laundry. But as they talked, the distance between them, literal and otherwise, seemed to shrink. At one point, Alice laughed at something he said. It startled him, that sound. Not just because it was rare, but because it reached him. He realized how long it had been since he'd made anyone laugh. When she caught him smiling, she tilted her head. What? Nothing, he said. Just nice to hear that. What? Laughter. Her eyes softened. You don't hear it much, do you? Jason hesitated, then shook his head. Not anymore. The words hung there, fragile but true. Alice's voice gentled. Can I ask you something personal? Jason's hands tightened around the rag he still held. You can ask. You live alone? He nodded. Yeah. No family. He hesitated, gaze flicking to the car again. Had one. A beat. Don't anymore. Alice's heart tightened. I'm sorry. Don't be, he said softly. It's life. He paused, his jaw working as if the words cost him something. My son died 6 years ago. Leukemia. The world seemed to still. Even the cicadas quieted for a moment. Alice didn't speak right away. She didn't say I'm so sorry, or that must have been hard. She just stepped closer to the fence, close enough that he could see the shimmer of tears in her eyes. What was his name, she asked. Sammy. She nodded, like she was memorizing it. Sammy. Jason swallowed hard. He was 9. Smart. Brave as hell. Alice didn't try to fill the silence that followed. She just let it be, heavy and sacred. After a while, Jason said quietly, You're the first person I've said his name to in years. Her voice was barely a whisper. Then thank you for trusting me with it. They stood there like that for a long time. Two people connected by loss and the courage to name it. Eventually, Alice said, you know, I think he'd like what you're doing with that car. Jason smiled, faint and trembling. Yeah, he loved red cars. Then it's perfect, she said. When he looked at her, there was a different kind of warmth in his eyes now. Not romantic. Not yet, but something deeper. Recognition. You're easy to talk to, he said quietly. I'm not doing anything, she replied. Exactly. When Alice went inside later, she stood by the door for a long moment, her heart aching, not with pity, but empathy. She'd seen broken men before. But Jason wasn't broken. He was healing, slowly, carefully, like a man rebuilding something precious piece by piece. And maybe, just maybe, she thought, we're both rebuilding at the same time. Chapter 5, Scooter and the Chevy. The first time Scott called him Jace, Jason nearly dropped a wrench. It was a Saturday afternoon in late August. The garage door was wide open, sunlight spilling across the workbench. Jason had been explaining how to bleed the brake lines on the 57 when Scott, with all the casual confidence of a 13-year-old, said, got it, Jace. You don't have to hover. Jason turned slowly. What did you call me? Scott froze, wide-eyed. Jace. Sorry. Everyone at school shortens names. I can stop. Jason laughed, a sound that surprised even him. No harm done, Scooter. He tossed the rag toward the kid, who caught it midair and grinned. Scott worked beside him most weekends now. Sometimes they talked, sometimes they didn't. But the rhythm of their time together was easy, familiar. Jason showed him how to check the timing chain, how to sand the trim, how to listen to the sound of an engine like it was speaking a language. Scott soaked it up. It's like the car's breathing, he said one day. Jason nodded. Yeah, every engine's got its own heartbeat. The boy smiled, smudged with grease, and Jason had to look away for a second. The sight of a kid's grin in this garage, it hit something deep. For a moment, Sammy's laughter echoed through memory, clear and bright. He steadied himself, focusing on the wrench in his hand. Hand me that socket, Scooter. Alice watched from her kitchen window, arms folded, chin resting on her wrist. Scott was happier than she'd seen him in years, more open, more confident. She knew what a gift that was. And Jason, well, Jason had changed too. When they first met, there had been a heaviness to him, like a man carved from stone. Now, she caught glimpses of softness. The way he smiled at Scott's jokes, how he hummed while working, how he'd stand in the driveway at dusk just to watch the sunset. It made her heart ache in a strange, hopeful way. That evening, after Scott had gone inside, Jason lingered by the fence. Alice came out with 2 mugs of tea, holding one out to him over the rail. Peace offering, she said, for the child labor you've endured. Jason took it, smiling faintly. He's a quick study. Might have to hire him full-time. Good luck paying him. He charges in pizza. Jason chuckled. That I can manage. They stood there in easy silence for a while, sipping tea as the cicadas started their nightly hum. He's a good kid, Alice, Jason said finally. You did a hell of a job. She looked down at her cup. I try. His dad. He wasn't exactly a role model. Left when Scott was 8. Jason nodded. Then the kid's lucky. He's got you. Her eyes lifted, meeting his. And lately he's got you too. Jason blinked, caught off guard. I mean that, she said softly. He's been through a lot. I think he needed someone who listens. You have that gift, Jason. He didn't know what to say. Compliments always felt like shoes that didn't quite fit. But this one lodged in his chest, warm and real. Thanks, he said quietly. I like having him around. Reminds me. He trailed off, unable to finish. Alice reached across the fence, resting her hand lightly on his arm. You don't have to explain. For a moment, the world narrowed to the sound of crickets and the cool night air between them. Her touch was gentle but grounding, a bridge between the past and what might still be possible. The next weekend, Scott begged Jason to let him help install the new steering wheel. Jason gave in, guiding the boys' hands as they tightened the bolts. There, Jason said. She's starting to look like herself again. Scott grinned. When it's done, can we go for a drive? Jason hesitated. It'll be auctioned off for charity. Oh, Scott's face fell a little. Right? For kids with leukemia, right? Jason nodded. Yeah. Scott looked at him for a long moment. Was your son one of them? Jason froze, caught between instinct and truth. But Scott's eyes weren't pitying. They were honest, searching. Yeah, Jason said softly. He was. His name was Sammy. Scott nodded slowly. Then this car's for him. Huh. Jason's throat tightened. Yeah, kid. It is. Scott smiled, the kind of smile that had no awkwardness in it. Just understanding. Then we better make it perfect. Jason swallowed hard, pride and pain tangling in his chest. Yeah, he whispered. We better. That night, when Alice came to the door to call Scott in, Jason watched them from the driveway. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like an outsider looking in on someone else's life. He felt connected to both of them. And somewhere deep inside, beneath the grief and the guilt, something small and steady began to grow again. Hope. Chapter 6. The weight of Story's autumn came quietly that year, like someone pulling a blanket over the neighborhood. The air thinned, the lights softened, and the maples along the street blazed gold. Jason noticed how the leaves gathered in drifts along the fence line between his yard and Alice's. He didn't mind. Some things were better left where they fell. Scott was back in school now, but he still came over most weekends. They worked in the garage until dusk, the hum of the radio blending with the soft thuds of tools and laughter. Sometimes Alice joined them, handing out sandwiches or coffee, sitting on the step to listen. She liked how Jason spoke to her son, with patience, with respect. He never treated him like a child, and never talked down to him. It made her wonder what kind of father he must have been. One Friday evening, the sky darkened early with the promise of rain. Jason was tightening a final bolt when he heard the screen door next door creak open. "You planning to work through the storm?" Alice called. He glanced up, smiling. "Rain doesn't bother me. Doesn't mean you have to challenge it," she teased. "Come in. I've got chili on the stove." Jason hesitated, then wiped his hands and followed her inside. It was the first time he'd been in her house. The air smelled of cumin and tomatoes, and soft music played from an old Bluetooth speaker on the counter. Her kitchen was lived in, not perfect, mail stacked neatly by the toaster, drawings on the fridge, a faint stain on the table from some long ago spill. It felt real, warm. Alice ladled chili into 2 bowls and slid one across to him. "Careful, it's hot." "Thanks." They ate mostly in silence, comfortable, the rain starting to tap against the window. When she finished, Alice leaned back in her chair, watching him for a moment. "You always seem to be fixing something," she said. "Does it help?" Jason looked up. "Sometimes. Gives me something to hold on to." "From what?" He hesitated, turning his spoon slowly in the bowl. "From thinking too much." Alice nodded. "I know that one." "You?" he asked. She smiled, but not with her eyes. "My ex wasn't a bad man. Not at first. He just stopped showing up. Physically, emotionally. You wake up one morning and realize you're the only adult left in the room." She gave a quiet laugh. "By the time I found the courage to leave, it felt like I'd already been alone for years." Jason's eyes softened. "That's not easy." "No," she said. "But it's better than staying in something that keeps shrinking you." They sat with that truth for a while, listening to the steady rhythm of the rain. When she looked at him again, there was gentleness in her gaze. "What about you? If you don't mind me asking." Jason stared into his bowl. "Sarah, my ex-wife, and I, we were good together. Best friends, even. But when Sammy got sick, everything changed. Our whole world became hospital rooms, test results, pretending to be strong for him." His voice faltered. "When he died, there wasn't anything left that didn't remind us of him. We tried, for a while. But every morning, every room, every silence, it was all him. We loved each other too much to keep living in that ghost house." Alice reached across the table and covered his hand with hers. "That kind of love doesn't disappear, Jason. It just changes shape." He swallowed, blinking hard. "She visits his grave every year. We don't talk, not really. We just stand there. It's the only place that makes sense anymore." Alice's thumb brushed against his knuckles. "Maybe it's starting to make sense again somewhere else too." Jason met her eyes. The air between them felt fragile, charged. He wanted to say something, to tell her how her presence had started to chip away at the walls he'd built, but the words caught in his throat. Instead, he just said, "You're easy to be around." "So are you," she said softly. The thunder rolled, low and distant. Scott's footsteps echoed briefly upstairs, then quieted again. The storm deepened outside, wind rattling the windows. Alice stood and gathered the bowls. "Stay until it eases up. No sense in getting soaked." Jason nodded. "Thanks." She turned off the lights in the kitchen except for one small lamp by the counter. The room fell into a kind of twilight glow. He could see her silhouette against the window, her hair lit by the faint reflection of lightning. She looked over her shoulder. "You ever think about starting over? Like, really starting over?" He thought about it. "Used to think I didn't have it in me. And now?" Jason smiled, slow and quiet. "Now I'm not so sure." When the rain finally eased, he stood to leave. She followed him to the door, the air cool and damp now, smelling of earth. "Thank you for dinner," he said. "Anytime, Jason." She paused. "And thank you for letting me in." He nodded, voice low. "Guess we're both still learning how." For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Alice leaned in and pressed a soft kiss to his cheek. "Good night." He stood there for a second after she closed the door, his hand brushing the spot where her lips had been. The ache in his chest wasn't pain anymore. It was something gentler, something alive. When he finally stepped back out into the night, the clouds were breaking. A few stars glimmered through the clearing sky. Chapter 7. The anniversary of the cemetery was quiet, as it always was that time of year. No wind, no birdsong, just the rustle of dry leaves drifting across the path. Jason parked beneath the same oak he always did, his hands resting on the steering wheel for a long minute before he cut the engine. He checked his watch. 9:56 a.m. Sarah would be here at 10, just like every year. He opened the door and stepped out into the cool morning air, the smell of earth and fallen leaves thick around him. In his hand, he carried a small wooden toy car, blue, with fading paint. Sammy's favorite. He always left one behind. The path to the grave was worn now. The grass had thinned from years of quiet footsteps, from memories that never quite faded. He knew every stone along the way, every tree that had grown a little taller since the last time he came. When he reached the grave, he crouched down and brushed away the leaves covering the name. Samuel Reynolds, 2010 to 2019, our brightest light. He swallowed hard, his throat tight. "Hey, buddy," he murmured. "Miss you, kiddo." He set the little car down, straightening it carefully on the grass. The air was still, almost reverent. He could almost imagine Sammy laughing somewhere, barefoot and free, racing toy cars through the clouds. He heard the soft crunch of footsteps behind him and turned. Sarah stood a few yards away, hands clasped in front of her. Time had changed her, but gently. Her hair was shorter now, a little more silver at the edges. There were faint lines around her eyes, not from age, but from the kind of grief that reshapes you quietly. They didn't speak. They never did at first. Sarah came closer, kneeling beside him. Her hand brushed the grass, fingertips tracing their son's name. Then, after a moment, she reached for Jason's hand. Their fingers interlaced, just like always, the same way they had every year. They stayed that way for a long while. No words, no tears, just the silence they'd built together out of shared heartbreak. Eventually, Sarah broke the quiet. Her voice was soft, like she was afraid to disturb the peace. You look different this year. Jason glanced over. Different how? Lighter. Happier, maybe. She smiled faintly. I didn't think I'd ever see that again. He let out a slow breath. I didn't think I'd feel it again. Sarah nodded, her eyes glistening. Is there someone? He hesitated. Yeah, her name's Alice. She moved in next door a few months back. She's got a son. 13. Good kid. Reminds me a little of. He stopped himself, but she understood. Sarah's hand tightened around his. That's good, Jason. You deserve that. I wasn't sure I could ever try again. He looked down at their hands. The wedding band long gone, but the memory of it still there. I was scared I'd forget him if I did. She smiled sadly. You could never forget him. Loving someone new doesn't erase the old love. It just grows around it. He nodded slowly, feeling something in his chest ease. What about you? Anyone? She laughed softly. Not yet. I think I'm still figuring out who I am without being someone's wife or someone's mom. But I'm getting there. They sat together a little longer, watching the sunlight stretch across the stones. You know, Sarah said after a while, I used to think we were cursed. Losing him, losing us. But I don't anymore. Jason turned toward her, listening. I think we were just two people who loved too much to keep breaking each other with reminders, she said. Letting go wasn't failure. It was mercy. Jason's throat tightened again. We did the best we could. Yes, she whispered. And now, you're finally starting to live again. That's what he'd want, you know. He looked at her then. The woman who had shared his happiest years and his darkest nights. You really think so? Sarah smiled through tears. I know so. And I'm proud of you, Jason, for not letting the world kill your heart. He didn't realize he was crying until she reached up and brushed a tear from his cheek. You always did that, he said quietly. Catch them before I knew they were there. Old habits, she said with a soft laugh. They both stood, still holding hands. The sun was warmer now, the air lifting just enough to carry the scent of grass and fading flowers. Sarah turned to face him. It's time, Jason. He frowned slightly. Time. For goodbye. He shook his head. We've said that before. Not like this. Her smile trembled, but her voice stayed steady. This is the kind where you let go, but the love stays. You keep moving forward without looking back. Jason wanted to argue, to tell her he couldn't just close that door. But then he saw it, the peace in her eyes, the acceptance. She wasn't leaving in pain this time. She was setting them both free. He nodded slowly. Okay. Sarah stepped closer, leaned in, and kissed his forehead. Goodbye, Jason. Goodbye, Sarah. She turned and walked down the path, her figure growing smaller until the sunlight swallowed her. Jason stood there a long time, watching, until she was gone. When he finally looked back at the headstone, he smiled through the tears. Guess it's just you and me again, kiddo. But I think you'd like her. She's got a good heart. And her boy, he's a lot like you. The wind stirred gently, brushing through the leaves, almost like an answer. Jason took a deep breath. I'll see you next year, buddy. As he walked back toward the car, the weight he'd carried for so long felt different. Not gone, but lighter, bearable. The kind of weight that could live beside hope instead of crushing it. That evening, when he pulled into his driveway, he saw Alice and Scott sitting by the pool, laughing over something. Scott waved, and Alice smiled, bright and easy, like sunlight through glass. Jason got out of the truck and walked toward them, the sound of his footsteps steady, sure. For the first time in years, he wasn't walking away from the past. He was walking toward the future. Chapter 8. Learning to live again. The week after visiting the cemetery felt lighter, as if something inside Jason had quietly shifted. The edges of his days softened. He still woke early, still drank his coffee black and watched the sun rise over the fence line, but now there was a quiet hum beneath the morning silence, something like anticipation. Alice noticed it first. He smiled more now. Not the polite, practiced kind, but the real ones, the ones that reached his eyes. One Saturday morning, Jason was in the garage when Scott came bounding in, holding a flyer. Hey Jace, Mom says you're good with engines, right? Jason looked up from under the hood. I try to be. What? There's this thing at school, a soapbox derby. You build little cars and race them down the hill by the park. Mom says she doesn't know the first thing about it. Jason grinned. And you figured I might? Scott shrugged, trying to act casual. You know, since you're basically a car whisperer. Jason laughed. All right, Scooter. Let's see what we can do. That afternoon, the three of them were gathered in Jason's driveway, sketching ideas on a notepad. Alice sat cross-legged on the pavement, holding a cup of lemonade, while Scott argued passionately for a flame decal because flames make it go faster. Jason smirked. That's not how physics works. Still looks cooler, Scott countered. Alice chuckled. He's not wrong. Jason raised a brow at her. You're taking his side? Always, she said with a grin. It became their weekend ritual. They scavenged parts from old bikes, sanded pieces of wood, and painted the frame bright red with yellow streaks. Jason taught Scott how to measure twice, cut once. Alice made sandwiches and kept the music playing. It was messy, loud, and perfect. At night, after Scott went inside, Jason and Alice would linger by the fence. They'd talk about small things, recipes, work, books, but sometimes, without meaning to, they'd drift into deeper waters. One evening, she asked, "Do you ever get scared you'll lose it again? The happiness, I mean." Jason thought about it for a long moment. "Every day," he said finally. "But then I look at how far I've come and think, maybe I can handle whatever comes next." She nodded, her expression soft. "That's brave." "Doesn't feel brave," he said quietly. "Just feels like living." Alice reached out and brushed her fingers against his arm. "That's exactly what it is." The day of the Derby dawned bright and warm. Families filled the park, laughter and music echoing through the air. Jason crouched beside Scott's soapbox car, tightening the last bolt on the wheel. Alice stood a few feet away, snapping pictures on her phone. Scott climbed in, grinning from ear to ear. "This thing's gonna fly. Just keep it straight," Jason said, patting the side. "And remember, no brakes until the bottom." Alice groaned. "What? Kidding," Jason said quickly, laughing. Scott rolled his eyes. "He's fine, Mom." When the whistle blew, the little cars took off, wooden wheels rattling down the hill. Scott's car, bright red with yellow flames, raced ahead, the wind whipping his hair. Jason couldn't help shouting, "That's it, Scooter. Let her go." The crowd cheered as Scott crossed the finish line second. He jumped out, arms raised like a champion. "We did it." Alice hugged him tight. "I'm so proud of you." Jason smiled, clapping Scott on the shoulder. "Not bad, kid. Maybe next year we go for first." Scott grinned. "Only if you're my pit crew again." "Deal." That evening, they all had dinner together on Alice's back porch. Grilled burgers, corn on the cob, and lemonade that was mostly ice. The sunset painted the sky in soft golds and purples. Scott had gone inside to play video games, leaving Jason and Alice alone. "You know," she said, leaning back in her chair, "you're good with him. You're good for him." Jason stared at the fading light. "He's good for me." Alice smiled. "He misses having a dad. I think he sees something in you." Jason's throat tightened. "And you? What do you see?" She looked at him for a long moment, then said softly, "A man who's learning to breathe again." He met her gaze, and something unspoken passed between them, something fragile but certain. He reached across the table and took her hand. She didn't pull away. Later, when Jason walked home, the night was quiet except for the hum of crickets. He paused by the fence and looked back at Alice's porch light glowing softly in the dark. For the first time in years, he didn't feel haunted by what he'd lost. He felt grateful for what had found him. He smiled to himself, a quiet, steady thing, and whispered into the night, "Good night, Sammy." Chapter 9. The sound of summer bled gently into fall, but for Jason, the days seemed to hold on to the light just a little longer this year. The morning started with the familiar smell of coffee and the sound of Scott's laughter spilling over the fence. Sometimes Alice joined him, barefoot in the grass, waving her mug in greeting. The sight had become something like sunrise itself, steady, certain, impossible not to look forward to. In June, the Chevy finally roared to life. It happened on a Saturday, after months of sanding, rewiring, and 100 little setbacks. Jason twisted the key, and the engine coughed once, twice, then settled into a low, perfect growl. The sound filled the garage and spilled into the driveway like thunder. Scott whooped and threw both hands in the air. "She's alive." Alice clapped from the doorway, her grin wide and proud. "You did it." Jason just sat there for a second, his hands gripping the steering wheel, eyes closed. The vibration of the engine ran through him, deep and steady. For the first time in years, he felt that same thrum in his chest, something alive, something moving forward. When he opened his eyes, both of them were looking at him. He smiled, a little dazed. "We did it." Scott leaned against the car, beaming. "You think Sammy would like it?" Jason swallowed hard, nodding. Yeah, I think he would." Alice placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "He'd be proud of you." Jason didn't trust his voice, so he just nodded again, letting the rumble of the engine say the rest. The months that followed were filled with a kind of ordinary magic. They went to the county fair in July. Scott tried to win Alice a stuffed bear at the ring toss, and when he missed every shot, Jason quietly stepped up and landed one on his first throw. Scott had groaned. "Seriously?" Jason had just handed him the bear. "You can say you loosened it up for me." Alice had laughed, her hand brushing Jason's arm a little longer than before. In August, they hosted a neighborhood barbecue. Jason grilled while Scott and the other kids splashed in the pool. Alice moved through the yard with easy grace, chatting, laughing, keeping things moving. At one point, she caught Jason's eye across the crowd and gave him a small, private smile that made his heart skip like a misfiring spark plug. Evenings were quieter. After Scott went to bed, Jason and Alice often found themselves on her porch swing, sharing a blanket and talking softly about the day. She told him about the years she'd spent trying to make her old life work, about the exhaustion of pretending to be happy. He listened, and when she faltered, he reached over and took her hand. Sometimes he talked too, about the hospital days, about the helplessness, about how he'd thought his life ended the same day Sammy's did. Alice never interrupted. She just listened, her eyes steady, her fingers tracing small circles against his palm until the memories hurt a little less. There were no promises, no declarations. Just the quiet rhythm of two people finding their way back to living. By early September, the Chevy was ready. Polished to a mirror finish, chrome gleaming, paint deep enough to drown in. Jason had added one small detail, a brass plate on the dashboard that read for Sammy. The night before the auction, he and Scott stood in the garage, admiring their work. Scott whistled low. She's perfect. Jason smiled. You did good, kid. Scott grinned. We both did. Alice leaned in the doorway, arms folded. I can't believe you're really letting it go. Jason looked at her, then at the car. That was always the plan. It's not about holding on. It's about helping someone else hold on a little longer. Alice nodded, understanding. Still, it's beautiful. He smiled. So's what comes next. The auction was held on a crisp Saturday afternoon at the local community center. The turnout was bigger than anyone expected. Families, mechanics, survivors. When the Chevy rolled up on stage, sunlight flashed across the hood, and for a moment, the whole room seemed to hold its breath. The bidding started, and within minutes, the numbers climbed higher and higher. When the final gavel came down, the total left Jason speechless. Every dollar would go to leukemia research. The crowd applauded. People came up to thank him. Jason shook hands, smiled, but it all felt far away. What mattered was the warmth in his chest and the quiet pride on Alice's face as she stood beside him. When it was over, she whispered, "You did it, Jace." He turned to her, his voice rough. "No, we did." That evening, they walked home under the glow of streetlights. Scott ran ahead, pretending his arms were wings. Alice slipped her hand into Jason's. He didn't pull away. "Feels strange," she said softly. "Closing a chapter." Jason nodded. "Maybe it's just making room for the next one." She smiled, leaning her head against his shoulder. "I think I'd like to read that one with you." Jason laughed quietly. "Then let's write it slow." As they turned down their street, Scott's laughter echoing ahead of them, Jason felt something settle deep inside him, a peace he hadn't known he was still searching for. And when he looked up at the night sky, he thought he saw a single star burn a little brighter, as if someone, somewhere, was smiling back. Chapter 10. The Things We Keep. October arrived dressed in gold and wind. The trees along Willow Lane blazed with color, leaves scattering across lawns like confetti. Jason had always loved this time of year. Cool mornings, long shadows, the smell of wood smoke drifting from somewhere down the block. But this October felt different. It felt alive. It started with a knock on Alice's door. Jason had been replacing a section of fence when he heard it, a solid, professional kind of knock. He glanced up just in time to see a man in a gray suit hand Alice an envelope. She thanked him, shut the door, and stood for a long moment staring at whatever she held. Later that evening, she stopped by Jason's place, her expression caught somewhere between excitement and worry. "Got a minute?" she asked. "Always," he said, setting down his tools. They sat on the back steps, the air smelling faintly of cut grass and autumn rain. Alice turned the envelope over in her hands. "It's from the company I used to work for in Chicago," she said finally. "Before Scott and I moved here. They're opening a new branch. They want me to come back, head of operations this time." Jason blinked. "That's big." "Yeah," she said softly. "Big pay raise. Better benefits. They'd even help with moving costs." She paused. "But it's Chicago." Again, Jason didn't say anything right away. He just watched the wind stir the leaves along the fence. "And what does Scott think?" "He doesn't know yet," she admitted. "I didn't want to tell him until I figured out how I felt." Jason nodded slowly. "And how do you feel?" Alice exhaled, looking down at her hands. "Torn. I came here to start over, to build something calm and safe. And somehow I found both. But this job, it's what I used to dream of. Before everything fell apart." Jason studied her face, the flicker of hope and fear warring in her eyes. "You've worked hard for it," he said. "You should be proud." "I am," she said. "But the idea of leaving, of uprooting Scott again," she stopped, voice softening. "Of leaving you, that's what scares me most." The honesty in her words hit him like a gentle punch to the chest. For a moment, Jason couldn't find air. He looked at her then, not just at the curve of her smile or the way the wind tugged at her hair, but at everything she'd become to him. A neighbor, a friend, a chance to feel alive again. He reached for her hand. "Alice, I spent years being afraid of losing people. It made me stop living. But if this is what you need, if this is what's next for you, you can't turn it down because of me." She squeezed his fingers. "You'd really say that? Just like that?" Jason smiled faintly. "I want you happy. That's all I ever wanted for anyone I love." Alice's breath caught. "You love me." He met her gaze, steady and sure. "Yeah, guess I do." The next few days were quiet, but full. They talked late into the nights, weighing the options, laughing, worrying, circling back to the same truth. They didn't want to lose what they'd found. Scott, once told, took the news with unexpected maturity. "Do I get a vote?" he'd asked, grinning. "Always," Alice said. "Then, can we stay?" he said. "I kinda like it here. Got friends. Got a pool. Got Jace." Jason had choked on his coffee, and Alice had laughed until tears filled her eyes. It was Scott who unknowingly gave them the answer. 2 weeks later, Alice made the call. She thanked her old company, but declined the offer. Instead, she accepted a local position, smaller scale, less glamour, but meaningful work that let her stay near home. After she hung up, She stepped out into the yard where Jason was raking leaves. "Well?" he asked, leaning on the rake. "Well," she said, smiling. "Looks like you're stuck with me." Jason grinned. "Guess I can live with that." That evening, they celebrated with dinner on her porch. Scott joined them, drumming on the table with his fork. "So we're staying?" he asked. Alice nodded. "We're staying." Scott let out a whoop and ran off to text his friends. Jason chuckled, shaking his head. "Kid's gonna start planning his entire life around that pool." "That pool's half the reason he's happy," Alice said. Then, more softly, "The other half is you." Jason's smile faded into something gentler. "He's a good kid, Alice. You've done an incredible job." She reached across the table, fingers brushing his. "We've done an incredible job." The porch light glowed warm between them, moths flickering in its circle of light. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked, and the world felt simple, whole, and exactly as it should be. Later that night, as Jason walked home under the stars, he thought about all the things they'd chosen to keep. The laughter, the friendship, the hope. For the first time in a long time, his life wasn't defined by what he'd lost. It was shaped by what he was building. He looked up, the night sky clear and endless, and whispered to himself, "Thank you, Sammy, for leading me home." Chapter 11. Small miracles. By November, the air along Willow Lane had cooled to a soft chill, the kind that turned breath into ghosts and made coffee taste a little better. The neighborhood felt quieter, cozier. Windows shimmered with early holiday lights, and fireplaces began their yearly duty of keeping the dark at bay. For Jason, life had settled into a rhythm, steady, calm, alive. Most mornings began the same way now. Scott would stop by before school, backpack bouncing, to snag a ride, or just chat while Jason worked in the garage. The kid had an endless supply of energy and questions. "Hey, Jace," he called one morning, poking his head in through the open door. "You think I could help you rebuild that carburetor?" Jason grinned. "You even know what a carburetor is?" Scott smirked. "Not yet. That's why I'm asking." Jason handed him a wrench. "Then let's fix that." The boy's grin was pure sunlight, and Jason felt a quiet warmth settle in his chest. He'd forgotten what it felt like to have someone looking up to him again, not out of obligation, but trust. Alice's laughter had started to fill the days in a way Jason hadn't realized he needed. Some afternoons, she'd bring over a thermos of hot cider and sit on the tailgate of his truck while he worked. They'd talk about nothing and everything. About Scott's school projects, the neighbor's winter decorations, even the ridiculous mystery of who kept leaving cat footprints on Jason's freshly washed hood. One late afternoon, the sun dipped low, staining the clouds pink and gold. Alice leaned back, watching the light fade. "You know," she said softly, "I never thought I'd get this again." Jason looked over. "What?" "Peace," she said. "The kind that doesn't feel borrowed or fragile. Just here." He smiled, nodding. "Yeah, I get that." Their hands brushed on the tailgate, accidental at first, then deliberate. Neither pulled away. As December arrived, Scott came home one day, practically bursting with excitement. "Mom, Jace, guess what?" Jason looked up from stringing lights along the eaves. "What's up, Scooter?" Scott waved a paper triumphantly. "They're doing a winter charity fair at school. Auctions, games, all that stuff, and they're letting the 8th graders run booths. I want to do one for leukemia research, like the car auction." The words hung in the cold air for a moment. Jason froze halfway up the ladder, his heart lurching at the name. But then he saw Scott's grin, bright and fearless, and something inside him eased. "That's a great idea," he said, voice steady. "What's the plan?" Scott shrugged. "Don't know yet. Thought you could help." Jason smiled. "Yeah, kid. I think I can." The next few weeks were a blur of small miracles. Jason taught Scott how to sand and repaint old toy cars to sell at the booth. Alice organized a raffle, calling in favors from neighbors and friends. The garage, once a silent refuge of grief, became a workshop of laughter and sawdust and half-empty mugs of cocoa. On the night of the fair, the gym was packed. Strings of lights hung from basketball hoops, tables lined with baked goods, crafts, and hand-painted signs. Scott's booth stood near the center, its banner proudly reading "Racing for Hope." Jason watched as Scott handled the sales with charm that came straight from his mother, smiling, joking, even telling people about the Chevy they'd rebuilt for charity. Alice stood beside Jason, her gloved hand finding his. "You okay?" she whispered. He nodded slowly, eyes bright. "Yeah, for the first time in a long time. I really am." The fair raised a few $1,000s that night. Not world-changing money, but it mattered. It mattered deeply. When they packed up, Scott hugged Jason without warning. "Thanks, Jace, for everything." Jason swallowed hard, returning the hug. "You did good, kid. Real good." A few nights later, Christmas lights glittered across the street as snow began to fall. Soft, patient flakes that seemed to erase the world's rough edges. Jason stood on his porch, watching the glow reflect off the drifts. Alice appeared beside him, a blanket draped around her shoulders. "Beautiful, isn't it?" He nodded. "Yeah, almost too much." She smiled, tucking herself under his arm. "You ever think maybe beauty's supposed to hurt a little? Just so we remember what it costs?" Jason looked down at her, then back at the snow. "Maybe, but tonight, I think it's okay to just let it be beautiful." They stood like that for a long time, the world hushed and glowing, the past folded quietly behind them, the future opening like a blank page. In the distance, Scott's laughter echoed through the night. and Jason felt the sound fill every empty space he'd carried for years. He looked at Alice, her eyes reflecting the Christmas lights, and thought, this is what healing looks like. Not erasing the pain, but learning to live beside it, and still finding joy. For the first time since Sammy's death, Jason didn't feel like he was surviving. He felt like he was living. Chapter 12. The light between years. The first week of January came wrapped in soft snow and thin sunlight, the world holding its breath between one year and the next. It was Alice's idea to take a trip, just a few days away, no phones, no neighbors, no work, she'd said. And Jason had surprised himself by agreeing without hesitation. Scott had been ecstatic. Cabin? In the mountains? With snow? We have to go. And so, 3 days later, Jason's old truck wound its way up a narrow road that climbed into the winter woods. The trees stood like sentinels dusted in white, the air bright and sharp. They stopped halfway there, in a small town outside the city. The kind of place with a diner, a pharmacy, and a row of stoplights that always seemed to turn red at the wrong moment. Jason didn't say where they were at first. He just parked near a familiar park, the snow-draped playground empty, but for the swing set swaying gently in the wind. Alice glanced at him. This is... He nodded slowly. Sammy's park. He used to love the rocket slide. When he was sick, we came here whenever he felt strong enough. Said he could fly from it. Scott shifted in the back seat, quiet for once. Can we go see? Jason nodded. Yeah, I think we should. They walked together across the snow, footsteps crunching. The rocket slide still stood tall, paint faded but proud. Jason reached out, brushing the cold metal. I used to push him up here, he said softly. He'd laugh so loud. I swear people across town could hear him. Alice slipped her hand into his, her eyes glistening. He'd love that you came back. Jason smiled faintly. Maybe. For a long time, I couldn't come here. Felt like the air itself remembered. He paused, watching Scott climb halfway up the ladder, cheeks pink from the cold. But now, Jason continued, voice steadier. Now it just feels like home again. They stayed only a few minutes before heading back to the truck. But something inside Jason had shifted, like a door he didn't realize was still closed had quietly swung open. By the time they reached the cabin that evening, the world had turned golden. The sun slipped behind the ridges, lighting the snow in soft amber hues. Smoke curled from the chimney, and the frozen lake nearby shimmered like glass. Inside, the cabin was warm and simple. Stone fireplace, wooden beams, blankets folded on the couch. Scott made a game of racing to start the fire, and soon the room was filled with the comforting crackle of wood. Jason watched him dart around, full of energy and life, and felt that same quiet awe he'd felt the first time Sammy learned to ride his bike. Different boy, same light. Later that night, when Scott finally drifted off to sleep in the loft, Jason and Alice sat on the couch, a single blanket around their shoulders. The only sound was the low hum of the fire and the occasional sigh of wind against the windows. Alice turned to him. Thank you for bringing us here. Jason smiled. Wasn't sure I could, to be honest. But it feels right. She nodded, watching the flames dance. You've come so far, Jason. I can see it. The way you breathe now. The way you look at the world. He looked down at his hands, then at hers resting over them. I didn't think I'd ever get here. I thought losing Sammy meant the end of everything good. But it wasn't. It was just the start of a different kind of life. Alice's eyes softened. One you're still writing. He chuckled quietly. Guess I needed a good editor. She smiled, then leaned closer, her voice barely a whisper. You've given Scott a father figure. You've given me peace I never thought I'd find again. Jason met her gaze, the reflection of the fire glowing in her eyes. And you've given me something I thought was gone forever. What's that? Hope. They sat in silence for a while, the kind of silence that doesn't demand words. Then Alice reached up, brushing a stray lock of hair from his forehead. What do you think comes next? She asked. Jason looked around the cabin, the flickering firelight, the sound of Scott snoring softly upstairs, the snow falling gently outside. I think, he said, we build something new. Not to replace what we lost, but to honor it. To live like the ones we love are still watching. Alice smiled, tears glimmering but unfallen. I'd like that. He pulled her close, their foreheads touching. Then let's start here. Tonight. Just being happy. Together. The fire burned low, filling the cabin with warmth. Outside, the snow kept falling, quiet and endless. Inside, Jason finally let himself believe that he could love without losing himself. That love wasn't a reminder of pain, but the proof that he'd survived it. For the first time in years, the light between years didn't feel like a space to cross. It felt like home. Chapter 13. The promise of spring. By late March, Willow Lane had shaken off winter's weight. Snowmelt ran in silver rivulets down the gutters. Robins sang in the trees again, and every yard buzzed with the sound of rakes and laughter. Jason stood at the edge of his backyard one Saturday morning, coffee steaming in his hand, watching Scott attack the last pile of snow like it had personally insulted him. Careful, Scooter, Jason called. You're gonna dig a hole to China. Scott grinned, flinging a shovel full of slush. Then I'll bring you back coffee from there too. Alice laughed from the porch. You'd better. He can't function without it. Jason turned, mock offended. Hey now, I function fine. I just function better with it. The laughter lingered, bright and easy, the sound of a home filling with life again. The idea for the new project started that afternoon. Scott had been doodling on a notepad at the kitchen table, tongue poking out in concentration. Alice leaned over. What are you plotting, mister? It's not plotting, he said, holding it up proudly. It's designing. On the paper was a sketch of a small garden, complete with a bench, a bird bath, and a flowering tree in the middle. I thought maybe we could make something for Sammy, Scott said. Like a memory garden. You know, for him, but also for everyone who misses somebody. Alice blinked, touched. Oh, sweetheart. Jason's throat tightened. He crouched beside Scott, studying the drawing. That's a good plan, kid. A really good plan. Scott grinned. So can we? Jason nodded. Yeah, let's make it happen. They spent the next few weeks gathering supplies. Planks for the bench, stones for the border, a sapling that Alice swore would grow tall enough to shade half the yard someday. Neighbors joined in, just like they had with the Chevy. Mr. Jensen from across the street brought his old wheelbarrow, the Thompsons donated a bird bath, and Mrs. Perez arrived with a tray of seedlings and a knowing smile. You start something good around here, she told Jason. People notice. Jason tried to protest, but Alice just smiled, squeezing his hand. As they built, laughter became the soundtrack of their days. Scott painted signs that read "Hope grows here and for all our stars." Alice handled the design, clean lines, bursts of color. Jason handled the muscle, shaping the soil, setting the stones. One afternoon, as they worked side by side, Alice brushed dirt from her cheek and grinned. You realize you've turned half this neighborhood into a volunteer crew again? Jason smirked. Guess some habits die hard. Good ones should never die, she said softly, and something in the way she looked at him made his heart skip. By the time April rolled around, the garden was finished. In the center stood a young cherry tree, its branches dotted with pale buds ready to burst into bloom. The bench beneath it bore a small brass plaque, for Sammy, for hope, for love that endures. When they stepped back to admire it, Alice slipped her arm through Jason's. He'd love this. Jason nodded. Yeah, he would. Scott leaned against the bench, beaming. We should show everyone. Alice laughed. Oh, we will. The spring festival's next weekend, remember? Jason raised an eyebrow. Spring festival? She gave him a playful smile. And guess who volunteered you to help organize the charity raffle? Jason groaned. You didn't. Oh, I did, she said, laughing. Consider it payback for making me paint fence posts. The festival arrived with perfect weather, clear skies, a soft breeze carrying the scent of flowers and grilled food. Booths lined the town square, music played, and kids darted between tables with faces painted like tigers and butterflies. Jason helped run the raffle, shaking his head as people slipped tickets into jars with a kind of hopeful seriousness that only small towns managed to maintain. Scott ran around helping with setup, his voice carrying over the crowd. Mom, Jace, the band's playing. Come on. Alice smiled, linking her arm through Jason's. Can't argue with that. They joined the crowd as the band struck up a lively tune, couples dancing, children laughing, life itself humming with joy. Jason looked around, the colors and movements swirling together in a way that felt almost unreal, like stepping into a memory he didn't know he'd been waiting for. Alice turned toward him, cheeks flushed, eyes bright. You're smiling, she said. Yeah, Jason said, almost surprised. Guess I am. She grinned. Looks good on you. He chuckled. Feels good too. As the sun dipped low, they walked back home, Scott bouncing ahead, the evening glow painting everything gold. When they reached the garden, the cherry tree had opened its first blossoms, tiny, fragile, impossibly beautiful. Alice gasped softly. Look, Jason. He stared at the blooms, something stirring deep inside. First day it's flowered. Perfect timing, she whispered. Scott leaned down, touching one of the petals gently. He's watching, you know. Sammy. Jason swallowed hard, smiling. Yeah, kid. I think he is. Alice reached for his hand, fingers twining through his. You did this, she said. You gave us all something to grow toward. Jason shook his head. We did this. Together. She smiled. Then let's keep doing it. He looked at her, sunlight fading behind her, blossoms falling like soft snow around them. I'm all in, he said quietly. And as the three of them stood there, hand in hand, laughter in the air, petals drifting down like blessings, Jason knew that for the first time since his world had broken, it had finally begun to bloom again. Chapter 14. The shape of forever. A year later, Willow Lane had learned the shape of their laughter. The garden out back had grown wild and beautiful, a small kingdom of color and scent. The cherry tree stood taller now, its branches arcing over the bench like a promise kept. Every morning, Jason would wander out with his coffee, brushing petals off the plaque with his thumb before the day began. Inside the house, the rhythm of life beat steady. The thump of Scott's sneakers on the stairs, the sizzle of breakfast, Alice humming some half-familiar tune as sunlight poured through the kitchen window. It was the kind of music Jason never wanted to stop hearing. Big day, huh? Alice teased, setting a plate in front of him. Pancakes shaped like hearts because Scott insisted on tradition. Jason grinned. Depends who you ask. I just wanted a quiet day. Yeah, sure, she said, smirking. Tell that to the 30 people coming over this afternoon. Scott leaned around the doorway, hair messy, tie crooked. Don't listen to him, Mom. He's pretending to be chill. Inside, he's totally freaking out. Jason arched a brow. You're supposed to be on my side, Scooter. Scott grinned. I am. That's why I'm keeping you humble. They all laughed, the sound tumbling through the house like sunlight. By noon, the backyard was alive with voices. The same neighbors who'd helped them build the garden returned. Jensen, the Thompsons, Mrs. Perez with her trademark lemon bars. Music drifted from a speaker hidden behind the flower beds, and the air smelled of lilacs and barbecue. The wedding wasn't grand. It didn't need to be. Alice had chosen a simple white sundress, her hair pinned loosely with tiny blossoms that Scott and Mrs. Perez had picked that morning. Jason wore a light gray suit, sleeves rolled up, no tie. Just him, comfortable in the life he'd finally learned to live again. When the music softened and everyone turned toward the garden, Alice walked down the short path that led from the porch to the cherry tree, sunlight glinting off the ring she already wore, a quiet promise from months before, when Jason had asked her not just to share his home, but his whole heart. Scott stood proudly between them as best man, or, as he insisted, best son. He'd grown taller over the year, his confidence steady, his grin unchanged. The officiant, an old friend from the restoration shop, cleared his throat. "We're here today to celebrate not just love found, but love rebuilt," he said. "Life has a way of breaking us. But sometimes, if we're lucky, we meet the people who help us put the pieces back together, stronger than before." Jason met Alice's eyes, and for a moment, everything else faded. The sound of the wind, the smell of spring, even the ache that used to live beneath his ribs. "I never thought I'd find this again," he whispered. She smiled, eyes bright. "You didn't find it," she said softly. "You built it." He let out a quiet breath, half laugh, half prayer. "Guess we did." When they exchanged vows, the words were simple. They didn't talk about forever as a promise, but as a daily choice. The small kindnesses, the laughter, the quiet understanding. The ways they'd carry Sammy's memory forward, not as a wound, but as a light. When it was done, Scott handed them each a small ribbon, one white, one blue. "Tie them together," he said shyly. "For all of us." They did, the ribbons fluttering in the breeze like something alive. The officiant smiled. "I now pronounce you partners in all things, past, present, and future." Applause rose like birds taking flight. Jason kissed Alice under the blooming cherry tree, petals drifting around them, Scott cheering loud enough for the whole neighborhood to hear. The rest of the day unfolded like a dream of normal life. Food, laughter, dancing barefoot on the grass. Scott and his friends tossed a football in the yard, while neighbors toasted with lemonade and homemade wine. Music played. An old song Jason used to hum while working in the garage, now turned into a slow dance under the string lights. Alice leaned her head against his shoulder. "You okay?" He nodded. "Yeah, I'm good. Better than I thought I'd ever be." "Sammy would be proud," she whispered. Jason smiled, eyes on the tree. "He already is." As twilight deepened, the sky blushed gold and purple. Fireflies began to spark in the grass. Scott climbed up onto the bench beneath the cherry tree and called out, "Hey everyone, time for the last part." He held up a small glass jar filled with light, tiny fireflies flickering inside. "This is for Sammy," he said. "Because he's still shining, just somewhere else." Alice's eyes brimmed. Jason stepped closer, placing a hand on Scott's shoulder. "Let's do it together," he said. They opened the jar. The fireflies drifted up, glowing and fading into the night sky until they were just stars among stars. For a long moment, no one spoke. The air was soft and full and whole. Then Alice whispered, "To forever." Jason smiled, taking her hand. "To forever." Scott grinned between them. "To us." And as laughter rippled through the yard, the music swelled again, bright and full of life. The sound of love rebuilt, of family rediscovered, of hearts finally at peace. Under the blossoms and the string lights, Jason Reynolds held the two people who had saved him. And for the first time, he didn't just believe in tomorrow. He lived it. Epilogue. The long bloom 5 years later, the cherry tree ruled the yard. Its branches spread wide enough to cast half the garden in shade by late morning, its blossoms falling like soft snow every spring. Beneath it, the bench had weathered into silver gray wood, and the plaque gleamed where Jason polished it every Sunday. For Sammy. For hope. For love that endures. Scott was 18 now, taller than Jason, though Jason never admitted it. He was heading to college in the fall, engineering, with a focus on automotive design. "You're sure you don't want to stay local?" Alice teased one morning as Scott packed a box of books. He grinned. "Mom, it's 2 hours away. I'll be back every other weekend to do laundry and steal food." Jason chuckled. "And the tools, don't forget those." Scott shot him a mock salute. Naturally, the three of them stood in the doorway for a moment, sunlight streaming across the hardwood. The air hummed with the bittersweet energy of change, the kind that hurts, but only because it's built on love. That evening, after Scott had driven off to meet friends, Jason and Alice sat beneath the cherry tree. The air was warm, the crickets singing, fireflies pulsing like heartbeat lights. "Do you ever think about how far we've come?" Alice asked softly. Jason leaned back, watching the sky fade to indigo. "Every day," he said. "There was a time I didn't think I'd make it through another one." She smiled, threading her fingers through his. "And now." He exhaled slowly, the scent of blossoms around them. "Now I don't want to miss a single one." Alice rested her head against his shoulder. "Sammy's tree looks beautiful." He nodded. "He's part of everything now. Scott, this house, you, me, all of it." She smiled. "The long bloom." Jason turned to her, curious. "What's that?" "It's something my grandmother used to say," Alice explained. that the best things in life don't bloom fast or easy. They take time, patience, and care. But when they finally do, she gestured toward the tree, petals glowing faintly in the dusk. They never stop. He smiled, kissed her temple. Then I guess we made it to the long bloom. From the kitchen window, the soft light spilled across the garden, touching the bench, the bird bath, the sign Scott had painted all those years ago. Hope grows here. Jason looked at it for a long time, his heart full. They had all carried loss. They had all found love. And somewhere in between, they had learned how to live again. Later, as the night deepened, Jason and Alice danced slowly beneath the blossoms, barefoot on the grass. The air shimmered with fireflies. Their laughter mingled with the rustle of petals and the faint echo of a life once lived and still loved. In that moment, the past and present folded together, not as pain, but as peace. Jason looked at the woman he'd built a life with, the home they'd made, and the stars above that held the ones they'd lost. And he smiled, because this was forever, quiet, imperfect, radiant. The shape of love that never stopped growing. The long bloom that never ended.